Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Beggs, and I made this to help out other eighth grade Georgia history teachers with how they can use learning theory to increase their students' comprehension. So let's jump right in. The first part of learning theory that I'm going to talk about is behaviorism. And the first aspect of behaviorism that we'll talk about is positive reinforcement. So let's get right into why we should use it. We teach eighth graders. So naturally, we deal with very fragile egos constantly. For this reason, I would suggest making it a policy to use as many forms of positive reinforcement with students as possible. I mean, I hate to use the word possible so many times, but it just kind of is what it is. Using positive reinforcement is more beneficial as it gives an opportunity to explicitly reward things that the students do well rather than the more implicit rewards that come with negative reinforcement, which is important for our concrete minded students. Negative reinforcement has its place. Most eighth graders and their concrete mindset won't see that, though. They will benefit more from positive reinforcement. How we can use it is really simple. Simply praise students for doing well. Praising a student who is struggling academically or behaviorally can have a massive impact on their performance in whichever area they're struggling in. It won't always. Sometimes we will reward a student who is behaving well one day and they will fall apart the next day, or possibly even the same class period. But it's better practice to positively reinforce these students as much as possible because it can make a lasting change. We can also reward students with things that they want, such as time to do things that interest them when they are when they are on top of things and getting their work done, which gives them an incentive to get their work done rather than the usual, well, why do we have to do this that we get from eighth graders. Continuing on, we get queuing. Queuing is a lot simpler. Why and how to use it, it didn't even need two slides. Honestly, in social studies education, queuing is one of the most vital tools we can use, we can have. How most of the events in history will play out can be predicted by our students without the normally required specific background knowledge of the event, that stuff of what happened before all this that caused it. And the reason we can accomplish this in this specific field is asking the students the simple Q question: if you were in whatever the situation is, what would you do? If asked properly, this can pull from our students' knowledge of something they already understand very well, even though they might not comprehend that they fully understand it, and will help them remember the why of the event, why it happened the way it did. And that simple thing is human nature. We already have an opportunity to constantly cue students and help them pull on this background nature simply because what happened in history is a study not really of the events but of human nature itself. So let's move on to our next set of theories, and these come from the School of Cognition. So, up first, myelination. Myelination and why we should use it. This is one of the most complex ideas in biology. It's very hard to explain biologically with the way that the myelin sheath will grow thicker and more useful. I can't think of the word I want here, but it'll be fine. The science behind myelination itself is simple. The more times we use a skill, the more defined the mental pathways needed to use that skill become. In layman's terms, the more we have our students perform an action such as practice the critical thinking necessary to analyze history, the easier it will be for them to do it in the future. The more we have them do something, the easier it will be to recall. And this isn't just a normal, like, oh, well, this is just the way it's always happened. We have scientific data in myelination to back it up. So, how can we use this? Well, complicated to explain scientifically, this is one of the easiest hows in this whole presentation. Simply keep the students using the information that you want them to remember. Have them write it down, have them draw something from it, have them color that drawing, have them discuss it with each other. Use it however possible because the more that they use it, the easier it will be for them to recall that information later on. Chunking. Do I even need to explain this one? Honestly, I think we've all used chunking, and any teacher, regardless of subject, understands what chunking is. But for the sake of argument, it is simply breaking large assignments into more manageable pieces. This allows students to focus on the small piece that they need at that particular moment rather than become overwhelmed by the sheer amount of work that they have in total. This is a skill that is useful for regular ed students, special ed students, all forms of student that we will ever teach. It's even helpful to me as a teacher in accomplishing my assignments to get these lessons ready. By breaking it down, we can just help our students not be overwhelmed and help them keep that constant motivation that they need to move forward. Speaking of motivation, now we move on to the school of thought of the motivation. Our first aspect of this, here is my lovely picture of Alexander Stevens. We'll get to him in a minute. And that is personal versus situational interest. The two forms of interest are useful and beneficial in their own way. Personal interest is fairly obvious how it's useful. Connecting our lessons to what students are already interested in is simply good teaching. By connecting it to it, we can make all these connections between what the students are interested in and what happened in history and link all of that together so that they can easily understand why something happened the way it did, as well as the how of how it happened, because they normally will have at least some understanding of if it happened this way, it'll probably happen this way again. Situational interest can be tapped into a little bit differently by calling attention to an odd thing in the lesson to increase student attention, something that's not normal for them to see. And a fun example of this is the picture that I used to draw students into learning about Alexander Stevens. As you can see right over on the left, Mr. Stevens was actually the vice president of the Confederacy. But when we get to that part of talking about him, I like to play a fun little game called Confederate Leader or Brain Eating Zombie. And as you can see from his visage, it can sometimes be hard for the students to guess. Very powerful person, but that little bit of weirdness will get their attention and keep them interested in the lesson. Expectancy value theory and what it is. Expectancy value theory is another theory that is fairly simple, but vital to all of our students' motivation to learn, and it can be broken down into 5 simple questions. The first one has to do with the expectancy for success. Does the student feel that they can succeed? The importance. How important is this to the student? It's real simple. Utility. How will this help the student in life? Interest. Will the student be interested in the learning? Cost. What does the student have to sacrifice to learn it? Those 5 questions, we want our students to have the easiest possible answer. We want them to always be answering, do they feel like they can succeed? Yes, they can. Is it something that's important to them? Of course it is. Why else would we be teaching it? Will it be useful to their life? Yeah. Once again, why would we be teaching it? Interesting. If we try, we can make just about anything interesting. And finally, cost. Is this a sacrifice that they are willing to make to learn this information? Expectancy value theory, how we're going to use it. I'll explain this using the student's least favorite topic, government. All of our students hate learning about government. So expectancy for success. By the time we get to this unit, the government unit, we're normally toward the end of the year. So if we have done our job, students will believe that they can succeed because all students can succeed in our classes. Importance. Knowing about their government will always be important to students' lives. Knowing how all of this works will allow the students to engage with the system that creates the rules that they will have to live by. So, importance and utility here really tie together very well. Interest. I have yet to encounter a student who is intrinsically interested in government. So, keeping things interesting will be vital. Pulling that situational interest in, doing the unusual things that keep them interested, talking about weird cases in the case of the judicial system, weird laws in the case of the legislative system, stuff like that. Anything it takes to keep the students interested. Finally, the cost. The cost in government's pretty simple. The student sacrifices the time that would be needed to learn this and is required for them to be at school anyway. So cost is probably the simplest one because they have to be here. They've already made that sacrifice. Might as well learn it. On to the school of the learning events, and that all comes down to one man. This lovely man over to my right here. Each teacher has encountered the teachings of Robert Gagne at some point. His work is legendary, but today I'll be focusing on his 9 events of learning rather than all the different things that he's taught us over the years, which are all vital. And those 9 events are gain students' attention, inform them of the objective of the learning, stimulate any recall of prior learning, present the stimulus, provide learning guidance, elicit their performance, have them do something with it, provide feedback on that performance, assess their performance, assess how they're doing with the material, and finally enhance their retention and transfer. The bold ones that are there, those four are, in my opinion, the most important and will be the ones that I will specifically talk about. Up first, gain students' attention. This is the first step where all teachers should start. If you don't have the students' attention, they will not be able to learn. Period. End of story. No amount of me standing up there and talking, even if I'm the greatest lecturer on the planet, will make a difference if I'm boring. So, how we can use it. If you think back to the situational interest that we previously covered, using something unexpected like an interesting picture or a title is a wonderful way to gain the attention of the students. Other ways that I have done this is with interesting, like cueing questions like, hey, well, instead of looking at it from the perspective of this happened in history, what if I change it and say, this happened to our school? How would you as a student act about this? And that normally can get their attention and get them excited about the learning. The next most important, in my opinion, is step three, stimulating recall. I've already talked about how important recall is because learning history is learning human nature. This step is vital to student learning. In history, there are two pieces of prior knowledge that always need to be called on in order for students to learn effectively. And those two pieces are, we can use this whenever we are teaching an event in history. We have to call back to the last event in our historical sequence. What was the last thing that we taught, as well as human nature? History has a clear order. It's already happened. We can't change that order. So this needs to be called on in order to assist the students that, hey, we just learned about this event. We just learned about um, James Oglethorpe meeting Mary Musgrove and Tamachichi. So what happened next? We become a colony. Like, you have to have that continuation of that order in order for students to learn the next aspect. It also links into something that students already understand but need to be made aware of, their own nature. How we react, if you know you need something from someone, you'll probably be more polite. The example I just gave, James Oglethorpe and Creek Chief Tamachichi. Oglethorpe knew he needed something from Tamachichi. He was much more willing to make a deal, just like the students would be. So giving them that opportunity can stimulate that recall of, hey, this is how I would act. This is how other people I know would act. This can help link into that lesson. The next step that we will be talking about is eliciting performance. In order to ensure that students are learning what they need to learn, they have to actually do something with it. So, how we could use this? Whenever I'm teaching an event in our history, I will ask the students to draw something about the lesson, or write a diary entry from the point of view of a participant, or even construct an argument that they will use to debate their classmates. A big example for that debate one is the trial of Henry Wirz at the end of the Civil War. He is the only Confederate officer that was executed for war crimes. And it's something that a lot of the students want to debate. And by talking about that and getting them interested, this allows them to use that information and strengthen those neural pathways needed to access it. Eliciting performance creates that lovely word from earlier, myelination. Next step that we'll be talking about, and the final step I'll be talking about, is the final step of the 9 steps, and that is enhancing retention and transfer. The final step is actually the most important of all, in my opinion. It even links back into step 3, which, if you remember, I was really excited about. A big part of teaching history is the understanding of human nature. By playing into this, we can help students to understand how other events will probably unfold in a similar way. There comes that transfer again. If they understand why someone did something, they can probably understand it in the future when someone does something similar again. To use this step, I often just ask the students to think back to a similar event in history and ask them to look at the way people acted, and then ask them to make a hypothesis about how similar events in the future will unfold. And that has worked wonders in keeping students thinking about that old information, as well as transferring it to new topics as we get to these similar topics in our history. Moving forward, we are on to our final school of thought, the social cognitive theory. And I have two things that I would like to talk about here. The first is self efficacy. Self efficacy is, it's hard to say. Self efficacy is the exact opposite of myelination in that it is very easy to explain, very hard to accomplish. This is because it is simply the student's belief that they can succeed, which isn't something we teachers are that capable of affecting. As much as we would like to make every single student that we teach believe they can succeed, that's something that has to come from them. One way that we can do this is through the use of self verbalization or positive affirmations. By encouraging students to look at the things that they are good at, we can encourage these same students to eventually believe the things that we already know about them that they can learn. So, an example of this, one student I had last year was an incredibly gifted artist and was musically gifted and was able to know all these complex pieces just by reading them a couple times. I was able to help her transfer that confidence in herself into history by simply reminding her, I can learn this. I can learn this incredibly difficult piece of music in a week. I can learn this little bit of history. And that had a miraculous effect on her learning. Finally, vicarious learning. Vicarious learning happens in multiple ways, but the two I'm going to be talking about are the reinforcement and punishment aspects of it. The reinforcement aspect has to do with learning of behaviors through seeing things such as praise or acknowledgement. If a student sees another student be praised for doing something, they're probably going to do whatever that behavior was that got the praise. The punishment aspect is the exact same except for the negatives. Seeing a student punished for their behavior will encourage other students to avoid that behavior because they don't want that punishment. Examples of these. Using these fairly easy and is common in most classrooms. For my classroom, reinforcement, I've always used my students' performative work to create a positive view toward it. So that sentence might not make sense, but what I'm saying is I will grab my students' interactive notebooks after they are done drawing or writing or coloring or whatever it is that we're doing and show it off under my, I guess it's basically an overhead projector so that the students can see other people's work. And I will talk it up by selecting and showing off work of students who put in effort rather than students who are necessarily artistically gifted. Other students get excited about putting in effort because their assignment might get shown off and talked up. And that normally causes them to put in more effort, even if it's a student that normally wouldn't do that. The punishment aspect is much simpler. In my classroom, I always have groups, and I reward my groups in my classroom with candy for proper behavior. So, for instance, if I ask my classroom to be quiet, the first couple groups that are quiet get candy. The punishment here is simply not receiving the candy. And after about 2 rounds of this, most students will realize what's happening and fall in line. And before long, they're getting quiet at such a quick rate as an entire class that I'm having to give out lots of bags of Jolly Ranchers because I can't differentiate between which group was the first one to be quiet. And honestly, all of these learning theories are so vital to our education of these students to helping them learn. I cannot talk about how important learning theories are to these students. Like it's just so very important. I hope you have learned something. I hope that you found something that you can use. Thank you for your time.